For 20 years, the undisputed king of rock and roll. The body of the 42-year-old singer who died from a heart attack is being put on public view at his home for 2 hours this evening. Tomorrow, Elvis Presley will be buried after a private funeral. From Memphis, Michael Cole has just sent this report.
The huge crowds have become steadily bigger throughout the day. A short while ago, the first of the fans who'd been waiting 18 hours were allowed up the tarmac drive, which leads to the mansion, where the singer will lie in state for the next 2 hours. It's doubtful whether all those who want to pay their last respects will in fact get the chance to do so. Members of the Presley family, including his divorced wife and his daughter Lisa, are in the house, and many show business friends and colleagues have been arriving. The family say they want the funeral to be quiet, to be dignified, and to be a family affair. The local police chief told me he didn't expect problems with the crowd. But there is undeniably a carnival atmosphere developing as dozens of cameramen and reporters join the sightseers.
Tonight, President Carter joined the tributes to Elvis Presley, saying his death had robbed the world of a unique and irreplaceable personality. His music had changed the face of American popular culture. Through the day, the Memphis telephone system has been nearly paralyzed by calls from all over the world, and the city authorities have ordered all flags to be flown at half-mast. Elvis Presley collapsed at his home and was found unconscious by one of his managers. He was rushed to hospital in Memphis, but despite attempts to resuscitate him, was dead on arrival. Doctors said there was no sign of excessive use of drugs, but they couldn't yet give reasons for the fatal heart attack.
Autopsy have been completed, and the cause of death is cardiac arrhythmia due to undetermined causes. The precise cause has not yet been determined for the cardiac arrhythmia. It may take several days to several weeks to determine that specific cause, and in some cases it never is discovered.
Within an hour of his death, local people, stunned at the news, began gathering outside the Presley mansion, the first of thousands anxious to pay tribute to their idol. Elvis Presley's career as a rock singer made him a symbol of the teenage generation, and over 20 years he never lost the support and adulation of millions of pop music fans. Mike Mackay looks back now at the show business legend of Elvis Presley.
In rock music, they called him the King. But it was the poor of America's Mississippi who first hailed him. A one-time truck driver, the early Presley gave white teenagers an identity and music of their own, yet he borrowed heavily from black music. The later Presley, with 25 gold records behind him, seemed to be suffering from as much as enjoying the good life. But if his fans reflected sadly on the present, Presley's beginnings were full of excitement, and he was largely protected from criticism by the affection with which his early music was remembered.
Rock and roll, baby, pour on his feet. Shuffle to the left, shuffle to the right, gonna rock and roll till the end. Ready to rock and roll.
Presley's career suffered an enforced break when he was called up by the American Army. Although stationed in Germany, he still never took the chance of coming to Britain. To some, it was an eternal disappointment, but for others, Presley was so much a part of his generation everywhere that it almost didn't matter. In 1967, Presley married Priscilla Bewley, daughter of an Air Force colonel. It seemed the final domestication of the former rebel, until it ended in divorce 6 years later. By the early 70s, serious rock fans were convinced Presley had changed. But after the army, he'd become a glossier, more bland entertainer.
The death who had been the undisputed king of rock and roll music for more than 20 years. Tonight, President Carter said he was unique and irreplaceable. Mr. Carter went on, he was a symbol to people the world over of the vitality, rebelliousness, and good humor of this country. Elvis Presley died suddenly last night in Memphis, Tennessee, after a heart attack. The private funeral service will be held tomorrow at his mansion house. Thousands of his fans are heading that way for a last glimpse of the body later tonight at what's being called a lying-in state. Here's a report from Michael Brunson from Memphis.
Elvis Presley was maybe at the height of his career, 10 or 15 years ago. Though his fans would dispute that, they would say that his popularity has never grown dim. And that's why they've come to pay their respects, to stand outside his house here, some of them to drive past the house in their cars, to pay their respects to the man they still call the king of rock and roll.
I just can't tell you in words. It was such a great shock to everybody, and to Memphis especially. He's a boy just like I was, raised poor, but he made it, and he was good to everybody.
All I feel is just hurt. I hurt all over.
Earlier today, Elvis Presley's body was brought back to his mansion, Graceland, on the outskirts of Memphis, and to avoid the crowd, the hearse went in by a side lane. Even so, some of the fans tried to follow it. Tried, indeed, to scale the walls. They were soon repulsed by the police who were in the grounds, and they angrily told them not to try and climb over those walls. Most people, though, simply stayed at the main gate of the house, where the singer led an increasingly lonely life. Another singer of the 1950s, Pat Boone, has said that Elvis Presley, whom he often saw here, had become a haunted man, afraid, for example, to fly or even to go out for a walk in public. Certainly his health had deteriorated. He'd been in the hospital 5 times in the last 4 years. And despite what the loyal fans told us, his mass popularity had declined. The faithful we saw outside Graceland today were in the hundreds, not the thousands, waiting to go up the hill to the house to see the body lying in a specially flown-in copper coffin, of which members of the staff said there would be no pictures at the request of Elvis Presley's relatives. Michael Brunson, News at 10, Memphis, Tennessee.
Elvis Presley made 45 records that sold more than 1 million copies. That's 11 more than the Beatles. Besides that, he got 91 singles into the British hit parade. His British contemporary, Cliff Richard, said, if there'd been no Elvis Presley, there'd have been no Beatles and no Cliff Richard. Michael Oliver has been looking back at the men, Elvis Presley, and his music.
Presley was born of poor parents in Mississippi in the Deep South in 1935, but he only began to take his singing seriously when he was a 19-year-old truck driver and a record company signed him up. But this was only the beginning, and the most important event of his career came when a shadowy impresario, Colonel Tom Parker, became his manager, and Presley appeared on the Ed Sullivan television show. The girls had gone wild at his pelvic gyrations on the stage. Now he had a national audience. It, too, went wild, as this MGM film shows.
Rock and roll, baby, pour on the steam. Shuffle to the left, shuffle to the right, gonna rock and roll till the end. Ready to rock and roll.
Well, I think he was probably the first white rock and roll artist that had ever put any sort of animation into his work, and he had this animal quality that undoubtedly hit the 50s in a sensational way. There's no question. There's never been anything quite like it. There's certainly nothing like it before.
By 1958, the biggest pop singer of the century was making million seller after million seller, 45 gold discs by the time of his death.
Well, since my baby left, well, I find a new place to dwell. Well, it's down at the end of the lonely street, that heartbreak hotel where I'll be.
You ain't nothing but a hound dog, a crying all the time. Old Shelby has gone where the good dog is gone. I'm in love, I'm all shook up. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I can't help it, I'm in love with the girl of my best friend. There will be peace in the valley for me, for me.
After 2 years of simulated wildness on the stage, he became Mr. Clean when he enlisted for the army and had his slick, greased locks shorn. But his popularity only increased. He married in 1967, and his wife gave him a daughter, Lisa, now aged 9. But Elvis, increasingly the recluse, grew bored with marriage, and they were divorced 4 years ago. After a series of mediocre films in the 60s, many felt Presley went soft, both in his songs and his person, ultimately his health too. But he could still turn on the magic, and his fans' loyalty when he appeared was as fierce as ever.
Take my hand, take my whole life through, for I can't help falling in love with you. I can't help falling in love with
Well, there's good news for any British Presley fans who want to fly to Memphis. British Airways maintenance engineers at Heathrow Airport have called off their threatened strike.
For the funeral procession making its way from his mansion home to nearby Forest Hill Cemetery for burial. National Guard units were called in during the day to help police control the ever-growing crowds flocking to pay their last respects to the King of Rock and Roll. Michael Cole reports by satellite from Memphis.
Thousands of people milled around the gates of the singer's home, trying to push their way forward to get one last glimpse of his body. The police let them in hundreds at a time, while the thousands still outside pushed and crushed forward. The lying-in state was due to last 2 hours, but it was extended by 90 minutes in an effort to allow everybody to walk the 300 yards to where Presley was lying in a silk-lined coffin in the hall of his home. For many, it was all just too much. Friends tried to comfort fans who'd waited 20 hours to pay their last respects. Even those on official duty were affected. The heat and emotion took a tremendous toll. Red Cross workers tended more than 200 people, young and old, suffering from heat exhaustion or simple fatigue. Some people had to be taken to hospital as the temperatures got to over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The police did their best to help those trapped in the crowd.
Need a medic down there? Okay, we need a medic. Need a medic outside. South side of the gate near the street.
One woman collapsed after waiting nearly 10 hours. It seemed as if it was a heart attack. First aid workers tried mouth-to-mouth resuscitation in an effort to revive her. They failed and she was taken to hospital, where later she began to recover. There was hysteria in the crowd, caused by the crush and by disappointment. At 6:30, police began closing the gates of the mansion, explaining that the Presley family wanted to regain their privacy. The viewing of the body was over. The decision provoked a bitter reaction from those who'd waited in vain.
This is a very private matter. The family would like to spend some time. You have to understand that.
This morning, the mausoleum where Presley's body will lie was literally surrounded by flowers. More than 1,600 wreaths were sent from all over the world, many from fan clubs in England. The tomb, which is bound to become a tourist attraction for Presley devotees and followers, is in a side room off the main chapel. Already the myths are being manufactured. I've met fans who say they're convinced he's still alive. And articles attacking the man have been written, saying that he believed he had supernatural powers and he would be reincarnated. That notwithstanding, his body will be interred in a coffin weighing 900 pounds, made of copper and lined with steel. The undertakers won't reveal its price, but like everything else in the singer's life, it's a superlative.
An ugly incident marred the all-night vigil outside the Presley mansion. At about 4 a.m., a car ploughed into a section of the crowd standing in the road, killing 2 teenage girls and injuring 4 other fans, one of them seriously. The car sped off but was caught after a police chase. The driver has been charged with second-degree murder, that's unpremeditated killing, and with drunken driving. His 3 women passengers have been charged as accessories. A report immediately after the incident by CBS television.
Eyewitnesses say the car came out of nowhere, plowing into 3 young women while they were standing in the middle of the road, a short distance from the main gates of the Presley mansion. Then police say the speeding car tried to run down a group of 4 officers near the gates, but missed and continued away. For the several hundred mourners still outside the mansion, the incident was horrifying.
All of a sudden, this car come by and started hitting people. People flying all over the place and metal and everything else.
It's cold, malicious murder. That's what it is. I seen him pull out from up at the red light and throw it to the floor deliberately to kill people.
Police caught up with the speeding car a few minutes later. They arrested the driver and his 3 female companions. Officials say all are black. The bizarre incident occurred while hundreds of people were still clustered outside the closed gates of Presley's mansion, a vigil that had begun early in the evening.
Thousands of people have traveled to Tennessee for the funeral. 2 of the mourners, both teenage girls, were killed when a car drove into the crowd outside the gates of Presley's mansion, and another girl was badly hurt. The Memphis authorities have called in 150 armed police and National Guardsmen to help control the fans. Elvis Presley died 2 days ago after a heart attack at the age of 42. Here's a report from Michael Brunson in Memphis.
The scenes here in Memphis have been extraordinary. The size of the crowd far more reminiscent of people waiting for an Elvis Presley rock and roll concert than for people waiting for his funeral. And the crowd has been so big that the authorities here have had a hard time controlling it. Before the funeral, Elvis Presley... Many of those who did make it inside seemed to wish they hadn't. Some came out with tears streaming down their faces, saying that it didn't look like Elvis, that he looked ill, that it was upsetting to see him. And when the gates were finally closed 1.5 hours later than originally planned, there were thousands who'd not got inside, who simply stayed on through the night. And it was into that nighttime crowd that the car was driven by a young man who's since been charged with, among other things, second-degree murder and drunken driving. In the last few moments, we've seen the final moments of the funeral, at least that part of it which the public will see. Something which thousands and thousands of people have been waiting in Memphis to see, lining the streets, the route which the cortege is taking. The actual service at Elvis Presley's house was private. The crowds were kept away, as they have been all along, at the perimeter of the house. And this drive of the funeral cortege from the house to a cemetery in Memphis, the same cemetery where Elvis Presley's mother is buried, this drive was the last thing that the public will see here in this city, which is mourning Elvis Presley. Michael Brunson, News at 10, Memphis, Tennessee.
In North London, hundreds of Presley fans queued for hours before a memorial service at Christ Church in Cockfosters. Many were unable to get into the church, and a second service was arranged immediately afterwards. Michael Oliver was there.
Hundreds flocked to the 2 services. For them, the king of rock and roll had been a lifetime's inspiration. Whether their tears were for the passing of a man or an era was another question.
Now, we are bereaved. Those of us who have in our place our heart for Elvis are much bereaved. And many of us are sad beyond measure.
Then the congregation sang one of Elvis's favorite songs. A leading fan spoke a eulogy.
just so fantastic that you've all come. Just don't believe it. But I just wish you weren't here. All I would like to say is that we have sent a very large wreath to Elvis in the shape of an E, and we have on it, apart from having on it "To our beloved Elvis," we have the words from the chorus of the Long Black Limousine.
Perhaps what we were really witnessing was the first in a long line of nostalgic reunions. Michael Oliver, News at 10. Fosters.
Fools, only fools rush in. Oh, but I can't help falling in love with you.
MGM film chronicling his bizarre life. When Elvis Presley died 3 months ago, he was the world's most celebrated singer. There was barely...